Hello there. In this video, I'll be sharing my thoughts and observations from trying out the new Volumetric Clouds in Unreal 4.26. I hadn't used any of the preview releases, so upon the final release of 4.26, like many, I was keen to dive in and explore this new feature. However, I noticed from various online comments that some people were getting perhaps maybe stuck at being able to create some decent clouds. Some things had changed over the preview releases, or they just couldn't seem to make any real changes. This isn't an in-depth tutorial, but me rambling on as I played around with the feature from the view of a beginner or novice, so I hope it will be useful to some. Okay, so let's start diving in and start looking at our clouds. And what I decided to do is I thought about using one of the standard default levels, but instead I decided to go with the complete blank canvas really, because I thought that would be the best way at being able to see what happens straight out of the box when you just start with some basic sky elements. And I could drag them in here from the place actors, but I found there's a really interesting new feature in 4.26 called the environment light mixer, and what this basically does is just enables me to create all my various sky elements in one place in one go. And it's really simple. It's a separate window, the buttons are on the top, tell me what to do. I can create my skylight, all the bits I need, and I've got them created in my scene. I did notice, however, that I still don't seem to have any atmosphere, and in the directional light, the atmosphere sunlight was turned on, but it just needed to be toggled, and now it's working. But the purpose of this new window is really good, because it enables me on a separate monitor to have everything there in one place, and I can expand out the various details that I need to see, and I can edit these all in parallel, because if any of you know and have gone into skies and environments, you really do need to look at these settings and parameters in reference to the other things that are going on as well. So it can be quite a delicate balancing act. Lastly, I need to create my volumetric clouds. By doing this, it adds my details there, and in my scene, I get my volumetric clouds. Straight out of the box, this isn't too bad. When I did use the default levels provided with the engine, perhaps didn't get as good a result of this. I'm not really sure why, but I think this seemed to be the best way to start off with things. The sky's a little bit bright, so I'm just going to dial it down to say 5, and then this looks a little bit more acceptable to me. Before I go into the volumetric actor itself, it's worth looking at the sky controls and how they all link together now, because what essentially we've got now in 4.26 is a more cohesive weather system. If you look at all these settings here, the things I'm going to just touch upon firstly are here at the very bottom. In the atmosphere and cloud, you've got various shadow settings, and these are really key when projecting shadows from your clouds onto the ground or your environment. And also if you've got anything in the atmosphere itself, whether you want shadowing on your clouds and how it reacts to the various lighting changes that you may want to make. There's also cloud ambient occlusion as well. And again, that will really change things in your scene if you want to use that. And there's also things like the atmosphere, like the Rayleigh scattering and the MIE scattering as well. They can really change the look and feel of your sky if you're looking to go for a more dramatic result. Looking at some of these for the first time, some of these are actually documented with the cloud documentation, and I'd really recommend that you go through that before really diving in, because there's some really good useful information here about how the clouds are rendered, the volumes and the three-dimensional textures that are being used, because they're really key to the whole thing, and also the light scattering, the occlusion and the shadowing, and what exactly is going on in our materials and our properties. There's some good reference here as well around these various parameters, and again there's lots of details depending on the type of result you're trying to get. Certainly if you're going for real-time versus cinematic, there's some really interesting parameters here to set, and that really got me thinking. First of all, it referred to these commands, and I decided to go, well, before we do anything, let's just look at our output log. And if we were to type r.volume, you've now got all these commands here, and some of them are referred to in the documentation, some of them aren't. And I don't know if there's a reason for that, but I think that's going to be something to look at going forward, because some of these, for example, is this one here, our volumetric render target. If it sets to 0, you'll start enabling the cinematic quality versus the real-time quality. And Epic have provided like a slider here in the documentation to see the difference between the two, and it is quite dramatic. So these parameters are going to be useful for some people, depending on what the context of their Unreal usage is. Anyway, I'm going to start using just one monitor now, because it's a little bit easier in terms of being able to see what goes on here. So we'll look at our directional light first and about those shadow parameters. I'm going to just get my sky, my sunlight down a bit lower in the sky, so I've got something a little bit more dramatic. And what I've done is I've just created a simple floor there for my character. I've got my camera speed set really high at the moment because it's the only way to get up into the atmosphere, into the clouds, and we'll come to that in a minute. But what I wanted to look at first of all was the shadowing, because that could really change the scene quite dramatically. Under the directional light, you've got a number of cloud parameters here, and these are the first one is the most obvious one is cast cloud shadows. When you turn that on, everything goes very, very dark, and this is basically the clouds applying shadows across your entire scene. But you can control this and dial it down a little bit as well to get a better control. I'm going to turn these ones on as well. You don't really see much to begin with. These are casting shadows on clouds themselves and then also to the atmosphere around it. And you can control these if you just scroll down a bit more to these strength parameters. Now we can control the overall strength, and if I dial that down, you'll begin to see it. And then we can control the atmosphere and the surface strength. And if we look at the surface, if I just dial that down a little bit, we can now start to see more of our ground come into view. Another thing I noticed as well is if you look at the sky, you do get this weird banding appear, which I hope you can see on the video. And from what I've read online, I think that's to do with the resolution of the shadow map. And that parameter is set down here. And at the moment, it's a base value of 512, but you can change it with this command. However, I don't know what the basis of that command is. I couldn't find any further documentation of it. It's set to 1 at the moment. If I boost it to 2, it does change something, but does that double it to 1024? I mean, I don't really know, but I'm sure that will become clear later on. In the meantime, though, we can control that by a little bit by dialing down the atmosphere strength, and we can begin to just remove it slightly and get a far better result. It's still there just about, which you might be able to see in the video, but anyway, we've got that down a little bit. But this means we can control that shadow separately from maybe the surface, and this is really cool because it just gives us far more greater control. I'm going to lower this down a little bit to say 0.5. And if you go up into the atmosphere, into your cloud, then you can actually begin to see, or you can't really see much at the moment here, but you will see dark patches on the environment as the clouds are beginning to cast their shadows. So it's definitely worth looking at that. And again, like anything, if you're going to increase the shadow map resolution, that's going to have an impact on your performance. You can also control how far out your shadows go with this extent parameter, and this is set to kilometers from the camera. So this is at the moment we're 150 kilometers into the distance with our shadows, and again increase that and you're going to hit more, it's going to affect your performance. Aside from that, if we go into the skylight, we can look at our ambient occlusion, and if we turn this on, if I go back to my mannequin, straight away this will have quite a big result, and we can see there that we start to get a bit more details now, and we've lost a little bit of our cast shadows a little bit, but you've got a little bit more clarity in our scene and it starts to look a bit more realistic. And again, there's some parameters to dial down here if you want to change some certain things. There's a little bit of a change there you might have just seen, but this doesn't really come into play until you've got more dramatic lighting, or if you've got a little bit more shape or definition to your clouds, and we'll come to that as well. In the atmosphere, you've got as I mentioned, the Rayleigh scattering. If you change this, you can get some really crazy results. And again, it's worth looking at that depending on what type of effect you're going to be trying to go for. But that's really the basics of the atmosphere and how that kind of plays nicely with your clouds now. And again, so it's really good to see that working, and also it's really good now to see the environment light mixer and have it on a different monitor and be able to control all those things in one place. Okay, so now we can start to look at our volumetric clouds themselves. And as I said, apart from the actual initial setting of the cloud, of the sun, sorry, I'm not going to change anything else. I'm just really going to go into the volumetric cloud here and start playing around with these parameters. The actor itself starts off, you've got some basic transforms here, but the main controls are these layers. And this is the volumetric clouds act on like a layer, it seems. And you've got two basic parameters here. You've got the bottom of the layer where it starts in kilometers, and then the height where it ends, also in kilometers above the ground. The defaults are it starts at 5 kilometers and ends at 10. And I'm assuming then with the offset, that means our height or thickness of our cloud layer is 5 kilometers. I thought that was a little high, because 5 kilometers, that's well over 10,000 feet, maybe even 15,000 feet. And I thought, how accurate are those figures? But then the thing to realise, to bear in mind, is what type of clouds are you looking to create? And if you go online and look about different types of clouds, of which there are many, you can begin to see from this chart on the different altitudes that these clouds will occur. And we can see here that at the bottom you've got 1 kilometer. Now we'll all the way go up to 9 kilometers. And this big one here, the cumulonimbus, that's quite a mouthful, that starts at 1 kilometer. It can go all the way up to 9 kilometers. So the idea of having our layer height at 10 really isn't too far off being completely accurate. However, that's not going to be the same if you want to look at some of these other clouds. You may only want to go as far as 5 kilometers and maybe start it at 1. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind, depending on what type of cloud you're trying to actually create. There's also, it's worth noting as well that there's a Guerilla Games did a talk at SIGGRAPH a few years back about the clouds in Horizon Zero Dawn, and I've pulled their PDF from their website. It's completely free, and I'll put a link in the description. And they talk about the same thing, about the type of clouds to create and how to create them as well. And this is really important because it will have an impact on the type of textures that you want to create for your material, and then how to set up your material. And again, if you change these, it's fairly easy. You can see that if I drag up and down, our cloud layer goes up and down, and the same with the max height and the distance. I'll keep it as a default for now. The tracing start and max distance, you really get a feel for those when you're actually further above, and you'll be able to see what they actually do. If we go further into the clouds, and what I did when I started doing this for the first time, when I got above to a certain height, I suddenly started to see things coming into view. And then I began to understand what these were actually doing. And this is the first thing is the maximum distance of the volumetric surface before you will accept any tracing whatsoever. And it's set to kilometers. So at the moment, we're 350 kilometers from the camera, basically, if I've got that correct. And again, we can dial it in or dial it down, but you can't really see much at the moment because the actual maximum distance that tracing will occur is only set to 50 kilometers. And if we dial that up, you can begin to see now how far into distance we go. And we could even go all the way out to 350 kilometers, but of course that's going to have a performance hit. And then we can start to dial that down a little bit as well. So again, depending on what you're doing, be it game level or maybe an environment for cinematic, again, it's worthwhile looking at this in terms of performance hit and being more optimal in what you're looking to try and do with your clouds. There's a planet radius set in. It's the same one that's in the sky atmosphere, except this only works when you don't have a sky atmosphere in your scene. So I do have an atmosphere in my skin, so that's not going to do anything. I'm not going to go into these cloud tracing parameters. I didn't really look at them to begin with. I only really started to look at them once I had a decent cloud shape and some lighting that I kind of liked and the effect that I was looking to try and do. I didn't really look at that until I'd actually achieved that. So the last thing to really look at is the actual cloud material. We can see if it's an instance, we can find out where it is in our content browser, and we can see what Epic have provided us here out of the box. So there's the instance. There's the parent material. We've got a number of noise textures here. These are 2D. Then we've got some 3D volumetric textures. They're doing a lot of the rendering of the cloud. And again, the documentation does explain about how they use the volume noises. And then we've got these two flat textures here. And we need to look at what they're actually doing as part of our cloud volume itself. If we go into the actual material, we can see there's a few parameters here. And a lot of them are grayed out. And when I first started playing around with this, if I just turned them on, if I just select these ones up to the extinction scale, we can change some of the values here and we can see what's going on, and it's having an effect on our cloud volume and so on. And we can begin to maybe see what's happening and we can try around with it, but I'm not really understanding what's going on here. These aren't necessarily documented. The beer powder and the beer powder power, that is something that is referred to in cloud rendering as well. And again, that's actually referred to in the Guerilla Games paper, so it's worth looking at that. But these, I was assuming, are parameters that have been set in the parent material. These ones here that are grayed out, with the exception of noise height and expression, and again, we can see what's going on here. I've got the height range, and you can see that I'm almost dialing it up or dialing it down. So this is controlling the amount of noise and how far high or low I want to actually have it. When I just want to have it at the bottom or all the way up through the entire scale of my volume. I'm going to set these back to default. Okay, is that working? You see it's working. Okay. These parameters are grayed out. The multi-scattering and the phases, they are actually in the documentation, and again, it's worth looking at those as to what they actually do. And they form part of these material expressions. And again, I'm not going to go into this; it's quite deep and complicated. But if you want to go in there, you feel free to do so. I'm going to leave that alone for the time being, but it's worthwhile just looking at that. And if you can understand what's going on, then I think it will really help you get a better result from your volumetric clouds. And we can apply some very crude methods to kind of see what's going on there. There was actually there's a wind vector, and we noticed that our clouds are moving, but they're not moving across the sky, if that makes sense. If we just turn this on and change the value to say 5 on and it's also a color value, it's an RGB. We can increase the wind, but they're not physically moving. If I just move my cursor here and take my hand off the mouse, this cloud there, this next to, it's staying in the same place. It's not physically moving or translating across the scene. What seems to be happening is some kind of noise filter being applied through the volume, which would make sense if you're using a volumetric texture, 3D texture. And we need to explore and see what's going on there, how to control that. There are ways of putting physical clouds into your scene and translating them and moving them, and we might come to that in another video. So I've got an idea what's going on here, but I've kind of reached the end of my playing around, and really to get any further I need to go into the material and see what's going on in there. So if we get into the parent and look at my other monitor, we can now see this graph that's in play. Now, some people say, but I read online, some comments were like, well, the material's not very good or it's not set up very well. I'm going to be a little bit critical of that. I don't think that's the case. I think what it was is some people may not have understood what's actually going on in here. I'm not saying that I do understand what's going on here, but I can look at this and apply some simple logic and observations and maybe put two and two together and make four. It's kind of in two parts. You've got this bottom part, which I'm just going to move off down here. This top half appears to be where the noise and erosion is going on, and we can see here the parameters that have been created that are in our instance. So that makes sense. We can also see from these texture samples that these are our volumetric textures which are being applied to create the noise and the volume that's being rendered. We can look at those very easily. And essentially you can see it's laid out flat at the moment, but really it's a 3D shape, and we can see that if we change the view mode into trace within volume, and we can see what that looks like. And you can apply some rudimentary change here as well. If we just look at if we go to the simple adjustments and change the brightness curve, and I dial it up to say 2, we can see it's made a change. If I just set that back down to default, we can see what's going on there. So that's how we can control the noise. Although it's very crudely done, we can see what effect that noise is having on our cloud. So we've got that one there, which is a 64 pixel, and we've got this one here, which is 32. And again, we can also see what's going on there. So again, I'm not going to go into all these because, to be honest, I don't really know what's going on here. But I can see that, okay, this is where the noise and everything is being applied. At the bottom bit is where the this volumetric advanced output comes into play, and again, that's also documented. And we also have our other parameters here that have been defined. And we've got now a couple of textures that are also being used. Now, it's unclear what they're actually doing, but what we could do, and this is very crude, we could just, for example, I noticed that some of the nodes get to this multiply, but this multiply isn't hooked up anywhere. Everything just goes into this conservative density. And again, there's an explanation about what that's actually doing. But what we can do, very crudely, is if we just disconnect that for a second and then apply, let's just see what that does to our volume and our material, and then we might be able to see what impact these two textures are having on our cloud. Okay, so we've now lost our cloud completely, so we need to just get above it for a little bit, and now we can see what's going on. And essentially what we've got is just almost like a solid block, really, and needs to go quite above it. But essentially this is the noise, because there's nothing else going into this now. These textures here are not, they've got no influence. And yes, okay, we can go into our parameters here and play around with these, and we might be able to get something that kind of works. But really all we're doing is we're just working with the volume textures. We're not working with anything else. And what we can perhaps deduce from this, I mean, you do get some really cool effects once you get into the clouds, and that might work for you. That could be what you're trying to achieve. But what we can see is that these textures here are really defining a little bit more shape and form to our clouds, and in terms of the type of clouds we want to look at or trying to create. And again, in the Guerilla paper, they mention this as well, about that you could apply noise to create clouds, and there's lots of examples of that, but you need a little bit more in order to create the real definition and also some of the organic shapes that you get from clouds. So again, it's worth taking that into consideration. Now, that's a very crude way of doing this, but again, I just wanted to show you just really what was actually happening here. And I'm just going to plug this back in now for the moment. And we can begin to see that if we look at the original, if we just let that compile and go back to what we had, let's just take a look at these clouds. As we see, we've got these weird mushroom shapes, and they've got a very distinct shape, and we can see that maybe there's a parallel between this texture here and the shape of our clouds. And again, if you remember what I said a moment ago about the height of our clouds and the type of clouds that we're trying to create, these are probably more like these big, these really like monster clouds. And that would really match with the settings we have in our volumetric cloud. Remember, it's set to like 10 kilometers high, starting at 5 kilometers, and we could even lower this to say 3. We can see that you could make a comparison between this texture here and the shape of this cloud, and you could say, well, actually, okay, maybe this is forming like a contour or maybe an outline or shape of our cloud, and then we do have these very odd shape, these straight lines. And again, I noticed some of the comments online by people saying about, I don't know what these straight lines are, how do I get rid of them? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. We've also got the other texture that's being used here, but we noticed in the graph it's only the red channel and green channel that's being used, and again we can see those if we just play around with our displays here. So that's our red channel, and there's our green channel, and we can see with the type of influence that's actually happening, that's occurring, and we can also change this for these adjustments here very crudely. But what I decided to do first of all is I thought, well, okay, let's leave this texture alone and let's start changing this this texture and see if we can maybe change this overall shape here. And to do that, what I did is I created some very crude examples. And the first thing I did, I thought, well, let's do something silly and just do this S shape. And again, I like to do this because doing something like this can really show a very obvious result. And then once you begin to understand about what's going on, then you can refine it a little bit more to get the result you're trying to achieve. Let's apply that, and I think we'll get a very crazy shape at the end of this. Okay, now we can see now the type of layers that we're creating. We've also got like almost a separate layer with a complete air gap in between. We've still got our straight lines. We can see that there's this one there and a bit there, but we can maybe deduce that this is what this S shape is doing. So we've almost got like a bottom layer, then you've got the curve here maybe occurring here, and then you've got the next segment of it. I thought, okay, that's what's going on there. That's what's determining maybe the contour, especially of the height. So if you've got your cloud set to a very high, if you've got your cloud layer quite high, then this gradient texture is really going to have an impact and influence on your volume. So I'm going to swap this out now to something just a little bit more less severe and maybe a little bit more appropriate, and we'll just take a look at this. And okay, this is looking a little bit better. Still not perfect, still a lot wrong with this, but certainly looking a lot less severe. And again, we need to bear in mind what's going on with the type of cloud we're creating. I'm not looking to do anything like this. I'm more looking to do something around a lower level here. So I don't really want to go more than 5 kilometers high. And again, I could maybe just go down to 2 kilometers and start to dial this down a little bit. And now these shapes look a little bit more coherent. So this maybe go to say 5 kilometers. That's going to be at 3 kilometers high. Again, they're not perfect, but they certainly look a lot more believable. And we've still got some work to do now in order to kind of refine the shape. Again, we've still got our straight lines, so that's showing that really that this texture is not the one that's doing that. And also, we don't necessarily have to worry about it tiling either, by the looks of it. This is where we need to change this texture now. And again, what I did is I just went to Photoshop and I just used the cloud filter and created these textures. They tile, which is the main thing. If I just choose this one here, we can take a look at that and even look at the different channels, because remember, it's the red and green that's been applied here, somewhat crudely, I know, But again, if we just apply that and see what that's going to do, then we can then start to refine it and then get a far better result. Okay, so we can now see that's really changed things quite dramatically. But now we can perhaps go back to our instance controls and see what they actually do. And we can now maybe get these back to default. Again, I'm just going to reset them all back to default again. And again, just this is the base noise, for example. Then maybe the erosion a little bit, doesn't really seem to be doing too much there. The erosion scale, so not really doing too much there. And again, we need to think about the texture. Maybe this isn't the right texture to work with this. It's a bit too fine and granular, but it's certainly looking a lot more believable, we might say, than what we had before. And the key takeaway here is to get these cloud textures working in a way that's going to produce a decent cloud. And it seems to be that this texture here, if we look at the this texture here, defines maybe the clumping of the cloud, for one, if that's maybe a term to use. This is very spread out, almost like a noise, which is not too dissimilar to how the texture looks. To be honest, it's very fine. There's no real hard shapes there. So we might want something a little bit more obvious, that's got some more definition. Maybe something like this, for example, where there's a bit more of a harder line, and there's a bit more of a harder difference between the blacks and the whites, essentially. Or maybe something like this. If we look at the red and green channel for that, it's a little bit more extreme, and we might get a little bit more shape to it. So if we just try that, and again, this is just part of the experimentation that I did, just playing around with it a little bit more, just seeing what difference these textures were having when it came to creating the different cloud shapes. And over time, I began to see that really spending certainly a bit more time and attention on these textures really would give you the shape and definition you're looking for. And key here is that they need to tile. That was the problem with the original texture in the default material, is that it just didn't tile, and that's when you got those really hard lines on the edge. So if you can create a texture that tiles really well, that's got some definition to it, then you will start to get some really cool cloud shapes. So we've changed our texture again. Maybe they're just a little bit, might need to change a little bit more now to give a bit more height, and maybe we've got some definition. So it's a little bit better, still not great. I perhaps just need to add a little bit more volume to it, or maybe change the texture a little bit more, maybe a little bit more extreme. So I'm just going to choose this one here now. That's a little bit more hard edged. I think we'll get some far more shape and definition here. Okay, there we go. And we can see now we're getting a little bit more shape and definition to our clouds, and also they're looking a little bit more organic. So we've got gaps around, and we've got grouping of clouds together, and we can see a little bit more. We've got a little bit more shape there. Perhaps maybe the cloud layer is a little bit high, and the key thing is this texture is a little bit more extreme. If you go for something a little bit more softer like these, then you're not quite going to get really those big large clumps of clouds. And again, that's something to bear in mind. And as long as the texture tiles, then you'll be able to create a decent enough effect. We can go back into our instance now, start to change this around. If I just go here and go to maybe this is the beer power a little bit more now, we can look at the erosion scale a little bit more. We can look at the noise, maybe just increase the height a little bit, because there we go. So we're now starting to get a little bit more shape and definition to our clouds. What's going on? And again, we've got these large clumping occurring now, which is looking a little bit more organic to what we're looking for. And then we can start now looking at some of the other properties around, like the multi-scattering, for example. Let's just drag this in here so we can see it. and we can start turning these on and maybe see what they're doing. I mean, starting to get a little bit more organic shape going on. Again, I'm just dragging here, not really having a clue what I'm doing really, but again, I'm just showing what you can actually do with this once you start really getting into it. Again, that's the scale of the extinction. It's about the default maybe. So yeah, so again, this is more by accident than design, so we get a little bit more organic shape. What we can do as well is maybe start looking at the sky a little bit more. Let's get back to our ground where our player is. There we go. Just change the camera speed so I can move around a bit more clearer. Okay, so we can now, there we go. It's not looking too bad really. Let's change the sun a little bit, and again, once we get to here, give it something a little bit more dramatic, like there. You start to see some of these shards of light. We can now go back into our directional light and start playing around with some of these values a little bit more. Again, change the shadow in the atmosphere, increase the shadow overall. We can then also go into the sky, like look at the ambient occlusion as well. Again, you can control the strength quite dramatically there. There's also the Volumetric Cloud parameters, which I didn't go into before. And again, if I just change that, straight away you can see just by clicking that on and off what that's doing. You've got the skylight bottom occlusion as well. Again, it changes what it looks like underneath. And then you've got these various sample, like the shadow view sample size, for example. Again, I'm just dragging it just so you'll see what's going on there. But you get the idea. And there we have it. So again, that's not looking too bad in the type of, I like creating quite low sunlight clouds personally, so personal preference. And again, once you've got this going on, you can then start adding other sky elements. You could bring in an exponential fog, for example. You can go into directional light and start looking at your light shaft occlusion and your bloom, maybe like so. You start to see more of those shards of light coming through. Might need to dial it down just a little bit. So yeah, and I think the takeaway from just this is really when you start to look at these materials. The key thing is you can go with any type of noise here, really. You can keep them as the defaults. The key thing is start thinking about the height of your clouds and where you want them to go and how high you want them. So bear in mind that the type of cloud you want to create, the altitude they want to look at. I've got nothing in my scene here. It's just a very flat landscape. So I've got no sense of scale except what I've got here. If I had a landscape in there with mountains or like a more elaborate landscape with forest or trees, it might become a little bit more clear in terms of scale and the height of my clouds in relation to the ground. So it's very hard to determine that at this moment in time. But I would really bear that in mind and start considering the type of clouds you're creating, and that will have an impact then on the type of textures you use to create those clouds, and then how you plug them into your graph. So this is really not a bad graph at all. It works pretty well once you begin to understand what's going on with it. So that's it for this video for now. This is just a very, just me rambling on. I hope I haven't gone on too much. I hope it's really been useful to some people. If it has, then put a comment below or like the video, and hopefully I'll try and do some more.